This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, the editor-in-chief at FanDuel and at numberfire.com, and this is episode 579 of the Late Round Podcast, on many shows that are part of the FanDuel Podcast Network. Thank you for tuning in. As always, don't forget about this week's FanDuel Podcast Network Listener League. Check out FanDuel.com/league/Listener League to join. It's a rake-free contest that costs $5 to enter and has $1,500 in prizes. You can enter up to 3 lineups to the contest. Again, that's FanDuel.com/league/Listener League to join. Eligibility restrictions apply. Go to FanDuel.com or download the FanDuel app for more details. We've got some great mailbag questions this week. Let's get to them. The first question is from @DotaVeteran. Hey JJ, do you think Hurts' recent low volume of passing stems from recent game script, a more run-heavy coaching philosophy as of late, or both? Neither? I'm concerned a lot of Hurts' value really came playing catch-up, and he hasn't had to recently. Do his upcoming matchups scare you? So let's talk about Jalen Hurts. As someone who invested in him a good bit this year, I've got concerns as well, so let's look into this. Look at what's gone on the last 2 weeks from a matchups perspective. They faced Detroit, where they see this insane positive game script, so it's not surprising that they barely threw the football. They also found success on the ground in that game. And then they faced the Chargers. The Chargers had a banged up secondary, but LA has been a team that opposing teams have run well on. Opposing teams have had more success on the ground against the Chargers this year than through the air. According to NumberFire's expected points model, the Chargers actually have the worst rush defense in the league. They've also allowed the most running back rushing yards per game. I think that's something to absolutely keep in mind with this. That not only was game script going a certain way, but matchups dictated this as well. And yes, they've become more run heavy of late. Not just because of game script, but I also just think it made sense from a game plan standpoint to be more run heavy given the matchups that they've had. Here's the thing though. Given their success, it would make sense for the coaching staff to sit back and say, hey, you know what? Maybe we should continue trying to do this. And that would be bad news for Jalen Hurts. Not that he won't get rushing yards. I mean, he's still had 71 and 62 rushing yards over the last 2 weeks. It's just that we may not see the rushing touchdowns go his way if they're utilizing running backs closer to the end zone. And we may not see as many passing touchdowns if their ratio is skewing more towards the run. So yeah, I think there's some concern from that perspective that they're just going to run more because they've had more success. But for all of you with Jalen Hurts, just breathe for a minute. Recognize that the last 2 weeks have absolutely dictated a run-heavy approach. It made sense to do that. And recognize that Hurts probably wasn't going to sustain his rushing touchdown production anyway. And that was helping him have those crazy high ceiling weeks. It doesn't mean he's not going to be good in fantasy football moving forward, especially when you consider that they get Washington in weeks 15 and 17. Those are 2 really crucial fantasy football weeks. Washington's had arguably the worst secondary in football this year. And there are games in there on their schedule, like next week against the Saints, where the Eagles probably won't have as much success on the ground. So here's my overall stance. Hurts probably wasn't going to keep up what he was doing, just generally speaking. But on top of that, the Eagles have been a little bit more run heavy. But I do think at least a portion of that had to do with matchup. But now that they've done well on the ground, they'll probably at least try to continue that. So I wouldn't expect the same type of game plan as what we've seen over the last 2 weeks. But a shift in philosophy is not a good thing for Jalen Hurts moving forward. And they probably are going to shift their philosophy at least a little bit. I'd still consider him a QB1, but I'm not in love with the ceiling the same way I was a month ago. So I'm somewhere in between the, oh, this doesn't matter, and we need to drop Jalen Hurts immediately. This next question says, I probably missed this, but why do you only reference Yahoo leagues when you talk percent rostered? I don't know if I've ever talked about this on the show, actually, but I reference Yahoo because through the years, I found that their percent roster numbers are more reactive than other big platforms. They seem more realistic. And that means they're tougher. If I use the parameters I do on the Sleeper Show, but with another platform's numbers, my Sleeper Show would be filled with a lot better players, or players who aren't available on most waiver wires. And that's not very helpful. And I'm working off of these big platforms like a Yahoo because I know the majority of you who listen to this show, you're playing on a bigger platform like that. So I'm playing into the audience to give the most helpful advice. and I'm going to Yahoo because I think that their percent roster numbers are just the most realistic. This next question is from @Jones_mobile. You mentioned Eno Benjamin had a good prospect profile. I'd love for you to expound on that this week. Connor is one hammy away from Eno becoming a legit number 2 running back at worst. Yeah, look, I'll be honest with you guys. I got Eno Benjamin everywhere this week. People really didn't spend that much to get him. I was surprised by that. So I ended up getting him on like 90% of my rosters. And maybe it ends up being nothing. But I think it's the right kind of bet to take, especially at a pretty low cost to acquire. It's not like I was spending a lot of my budget to get Eno Benjamin. Because as you noted, James Conner hasn't been able to stay healthy in recent seasons. And maybe there's nothing to that, but it's something to at least keep in mind. He saw a lot of work last week, and I fully expect Conner to be a monster. Hail to Pitt, by the way. But it's very possible that we saw Conner have that workload that he did last week because they played it safe. They didn't want to throw their third string running back on the field that much. Now that they know the extent of Edmonds' injury, they may want to make sure that they don't overuse James Conner. And by the way, I'm talking hypotheticals here. This is the bullish case for Eno Benjamin. You have to tell stories to see what a player's ceiling might look like. But in that case, they could use Benjamin more than expected. And he had a really good prospect profile. My model looks at 3 main production metrics: best season total yards per team play, best season total touchdown share, and best season reception share. Benjamin had well above average marks in all of those categories. Total yards per team play is the most important and predictive metric of those 3, and he ranked in the 88th percentile in that metric. Now, draft capital matters. There's other things in that model that matter for the running back position. I'm just saying that he wasn't a bad prospect. I liked him a lot coming out, and I'm excited for him to get a chance to see the field more. This next question is from @FantasyBaby3. What do we do with Kadarius Toney? By the way, not sure if anyone's ever told you this, but love the show. Hey, thanks. I think there's an honest chance that the Giants are dumb and they just don't put Toney on the field when all their wide receivers are healthy. But I also think there's a chance that Toney hasn't been 100%. And this bye week could be huge. But ask yourself this with Toney, because I've gotten questions about him a lot this week. Who are you replacing him with? What player off the waiver wire right now has as much upside as Kadarius Toney has? Because we've already seen that upside. He's shown it off, and it's pretty crazy. So to me, Toney is still the right kind of bench stash. I have him on a lot of teams, and on those teams, I'm holding. This next question is from @Don_Pacenti. I've suffered a lot of close losses this year, less than 6 points 5 times in my main league, which inevitably means there are different choices I could have made that would have resulted in a win. How do you determine which decisions were mistakes versus good ones that didn't work out? I make bad choices all the time in fantasy football. I make a lot of good ones, but when you're forecasting what's going to happen on a football field, you're going to be wrong. This is why I focus so heavily on process. Because not only does it help you make the right choices more often than not, but it also allows you to feel better when the results were wrong. If you know your process is a sound process, then you don't need to be down and focus so much on the things that you get wrong. Because you know that you were logical. And when you're logical, you're already winning. Crazy stuff is going to happen in this game. And there's even more variance involved when you're in a league where playoff spots are determined by head-to-head record. The way you determine which decisions were mistakes is through process and repetition. You have to have a process to win in fantasy football, at least in the long run. And that's what this show is all about. It's about honing in on that process. So it's tough for me to say what exact thing you need to look at when looking back at your mistakes. Because I just say, listen to the Late Round podcast for what my process is. The things that I look at, the things that I look for. And look, it's always easy to look at mistakes in hindsight and beat yourself up over it. Just do your best to try and place yourself back in time when you made that decision. And then ask yourself, did it make sense? 9 times out of 10, it will. And that'll put your mind at ease a little bit. And also try not to have any negativity bias. It's easy for us to focus on the things that you got wrong, but also look at the stuff that you got right. That helps a lot too. The last question this week is from @MLBAndyK. Do you think there's any truth to the idea that playing based on probability leads to mediocre teams due to the law of averages? Cooper Kupp versus Robert Woods in the 4th round is a great example where taking the projection/probability player has led to a middle ground team while Kupp is winning weeks. So I think that people view probability as simply playing for the median outcome. That's not what probability is. Probability is about understanding all outcomes. It's about finding the likelihood that certain results are going to happen. I'm a data-driven analyst. You guys all know this. But I've said it on this show before, and I'll say it again. I think it's a huge, huge mistake to draft your fantasy teams solely based on season-long projections. Yes, those projections are giving you the most likely outcome for a player. But you don't always want or need that most likely outcome for a player when you're drafting. Sometimes you want to look at a player's 80th percentile outcome. Sometimes you want to look at a player's 25th percentile outcome. So if you're focused on probability, you're actually doing the opposite of simply looking at averages. You're understanding the wide range of outcomes that exist for a player, and you're acting on that instead. Now, I don't know if Woods versus Kupp is the right example because I'm disagreeing with this notion of probability in general here. Probability-based thinking doesn't only lead you to averages. Projection-based thinking can do that. But probability is different. Projections give you a median outcome, when if you think with probability, you'll see the bigger picture for a player. This is why I do a show every year on the things that I learned when building projections. Because the projection itself isn't what I'm most interested in, especially with lower tiered players. Like, no one is drafting in the 9th or 10th round based on projections. They shouldn't, at least. They should be striving for that 80th or 90th percentile outcome. And when you build projections, you start to understand the probability side more. You understand the how a player can see an uptick in target share, how a player may be able to score more touchdowns than what he's being projected for. I'm a believer that there's a lot of nuance to this fantasy football game, and this is just another example of that. That's going to do it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you get subscribed to the Late Round Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter at LateRoundQB. Before I let you guys go, I wanted to mention that I launched EastCoastDads.com last week. If you follow me on Twitter, you know that over the last year or so, I've tweeted about East Coast dads anytime a primetime game goes really late into the night. Because East Coast dads end up going to bed like 2 hours past their typical bedtime. But kids don't care. They'll still be up at the same time the next morning. It's turned into a fun little joke during primetime games each week, and I wanted to do something to capitalize on it. So I started EastCoastDads.com, where you can buy East Coast Dads hoodies and t-shirts. And I'm not trying to make $1 on this. Instead, I'm donating all profits to No Kid Hungry, which helps feed starving children. So yes, East Coast Dads, it's a big joke. It's just a meme. But with a lot of people latching onto that joke and enjoying it, I thought we should do some good. Let's do something to help end childhood hunger. Thanks for listening, everyone. Enjoy your weekend. I'll talk to you next week.